Good afternoon. I want you to know, I wasn't planning to say this, but we've brought Caroline's children with us, their first trip abroad, and it's here. So there is something to be said for Arendal and the power of images in Frozen, because it makes all 4-year-olds on the planet want to be in Norway. What a joy and privilege to be surrounded by people working together on behalf of a better future for children and families of this extraordinary country. We have learned so much already in the 48 hours that we've been here, including the fact that you have the best playground for preschoolers on earth. It is your job, which you have fulfilled well already, to inspire collective imagination and commitment, and we are so honored to be here as part of such a learning community. Thank you for letting us speak to you in English. It's a particular joy for me as a mother to be presenting with my daughter. In our family, for many, many generations, intergenerational dialogue has been the way of life. And Caroline and I have been collaborating professionally for more than a decade on understanding effective frameworks for inspiring change in individuals, organizations, and communities. I enter that dialogue as someone who has spent the last 25 years dedicated to cultivating hope and civic engagement, mostly in large organizations, communities, countries, and the world, with particular emphasis on inspiring community-defined change initiatives across well-established divides of generation, economics, and culture. My professional experience, as you heard, is in banking, Christian ministry, and social entrepreneurship. But I really do think it's primarily my role as a mother and now grandmother that it most has influenced my thinking about public life. As a practitioner, I love to play, and therefore I love to experiment with promising approaches that help people gain new perspective and build new relationships to accomplish what matters most to them. Caroline brings a different generational perspective. She also brings a different set of tools, research-based disciplines as a clinical psychologist and teacher. She uses empirically supported treatments for struggling children and their families, and has brought that perspective and research to bear on my own community practice in ways that have been extremely important. So I really thank Anna Catherine, Elizabeth, and the other organizers for inviting us to speak to you together.
Can you hear me?
Are you on?
Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. I love that just before our talk you had this video about daring to be brave, about the courage to be who you are in the world. This really speaks to the heart of why we're all here together, asking questions such as, what makes it possible to dare to be strong, especially in the face of some of the particular challenges that we know young people are facing at this time, here and around the world? What encourages young people to take constructive risks on behalf of what matters to them? How do we gather and connect the strengths of youth and our own strengths in a way that can move us towards what we want? The social sciences have long recognized the vital role of social context in shaping human behavior and identity. As far back as the 1930s, Kurt Lewin, who's the father of social psychology, and his colleagues showed that changes in the social environment can lead to meaningful changes in the behaviors and beliefs of individuals within those environments. By the late 70s, developmental psychologists had taken this research further, showing how there are reciprocal effects between individuals and their environments. We change who we are when our environment changes, and our environment changes when we change who we are. The notion that people are largely defined by and reciprocally influence the systems and social contexts in which they develop has been established and revalidated numerous times in the social sciences. Seeing from the whole and understanding the critical role of social context in shaping learning and behavior allows us to view an individual's dysfunctional behaviors as symptomatic of imbalance in one or more of the social contexts in which that individual exists. Given the enormous influence of social context on ways of seeing and behaving, the creation of healthy, constructive contexts is crucial to helping individuals and families function at their best. I'd like to share in the next 10 minutes or so some research and observations from the field of psychology regarding some of the factors that I've seen and learned through my research are especially critical in setting healthy social contexts that help youth dare to be strong. First, parental and educational approaches that build or limit resilience and self-efficacy. Can I see a show of hands? How many people in this room have ever taught somebody how to ride a bike? Okay. So I'm guessing for most of you, there was a point when you went from having a child on a bike with training wheels to a bike without training wheels. And there were some pieces that you could probably predict would be part of that process. First, that child might fall. Second, that child might even cry and not want to get back on the bike when they fell down. And third, your role would be to support them through that and make sure they did, in fact, get back on the bike so they could learn to ride. I will argue that if you have taught a child how to ride a bike or even have a reasonably good idea of how to do so, you already have the core ingredients for teaching resilience to children. So what do? Picture that moment. You're running behind the child on the bike. You let go. They make it 10, 15, maybe 20 feet, and they fall. And the child's on the ground, and they look up at you, tears in their eyes, maybe scraped knee, and they say, "Oh, ouch." Let's talk first about what you don't do. You don't get more upset than they are about the problem. Right? Doesn't end well. You don't say, you're not very good at that. I'll ride your bike from now on. I'm better at it. It's absurd, right? Yet do we feel tempted when children struggle with social emotional difficulties to do that very thing? You don't know how to do that, so I will. Or opening a juice box, or buttoning their shirt for that matter. You don't know how to do that, so I will. Well, that's absurd. That's not how we learn. We also don't say, I had no idea this could happen. The problem is the guy in the park, the bike itself, and everything else about this situation except you. We don't blame others for the fall. We understand that it's an important part, and a small part of the learning process. And we do two things. We validate that child's struggle, and then we encourage them to get up again. Something along the lines of this. Ouch, I see that hurt. You are so brave. Can I show you why it took me so long to get over here? You were all the way over here, but I was all the way back here because you rode so far, all by yourself before you fell down. I wonder how far you'll get next time. Are you ready to try again, or do you want to take a couple of minutes first? Do you see what we're really doing in there? Validating the struggle, trusting them to learn from it, and letting them know that we trust them to try again and do better next time. Those are the tools. I share this with parents often when I run parent workshops, because this is really how we encourage children at all phases of life, regardless of the struggle. But the key piece in here, too, is to remember that social emotional skills, the very things we need to be resilient in a changing world, are built the same way as math skills, swimming skills, learning how to ride a bike. Practice. Watching, learning, practicing. This connects to my next point, which is this idea of growth mindset. Who's familiar with Carol Dweck's work around this? Is this a familiar concept? Okay. So Carol Dweck is a psychologist in the US who's done really amazing work over the last few decades around this concept of growth mindset, which is essentially the idea that when we see failure as an inevitable and important part of the learning process, then when we face a challenge, we say, oh, this looks interesting, and we move towards the challenge. If we have a fixed mindset, we say the answers are there or they're not, you're right or you're wrong, you're smart or you're dumb, and if you don't get it the first time, walk away. Now that fixed mindset is dangerous because it's the opposite of what fosters a willingness to take risks on behalf of things that matter. So how do we foster a growth mindset? We model imperfection. We give roadmaps by showing all the stumbles, all the detours we took along the way to get where we ended up, instead of just saying, well, that's the destination. If you can't get there, there's something wrong with you. We model vulnerability. And we communicate that process matters far more than outcomes. How you are matters more than where you end up. Who you are matters more than where you end up. So a third connected piece is psychological safety, which is the belief that one can make mistakes and take risks in a particular social context without fear of ridicule or rejection. Every human being in this room knows that. You have a person in your life who is a reliably non-judgmental, kind, loving person, and you're probably the best version of yourself around them. And everybody in this room has had the experience of someone in your life who made you feel not good enough, judged, inappropriate, shameful, whatever the case may be, and you probably became a less likable version of yourself around them with lower self-esteem. This is the idea of interpersonal context. So we know that the best predictor by far of collective intelligence, which is people working better together than they can on their own, is psychological safety. It's true in the workforce, it's true in any human system. And we know that to foster psychological safety, you have to be vulnerable. You have to show warts and all. So if expressing vulnerability creates psychological safety for others, and it's a precondition for meaningful connection with other people, perhaps then it's not surprising to learn that social contexts that punish vulnerability and make it very difficult to develop genuine, meaningful relationships with others, or to feel accepted for who we are rather than who we pretend to be, are problematic. Where are young people left when so many of their social contexts occur on social media? A context in which expressions of vulnerability may result in public humiliation or loss of status. What happens to psychological safety in a context in which mistakes are easily shareable and part of a permanent record? According to a slew of recent papers examining the role of social media in our lives, we've never been more connected to more people online in human history. We've also never felt so lonely, so disconnected, or so depressed. The adolescent brain is hardwired to perceive peer acceptance and membership in a group of peers as a matter of life and death. Really, biologically, this is hardwired. So the reward centers of our brain, they're part of our sort of caveman brain, if you will, and essentially, for most of human history, at the point we hit adolescence, our parents were getting ready to die. And we had to find a group of same-age peers to accept us so we could survive in a pack. Think about that for a moment. To survive, we had to be accepted by peers at adolescence. That's the same brain we still have today. The parts of our brain that signal that, our reward centers. So things that to adults may feel like, oh, why do you care so much what they think? Feels like life or death to an adolescent. It's therefore a particularly vulnerable period of development, one in which messages about what is valued by peers can be transformative. Those of us who work in support of youth are challenged to create context for youth that foster a sense of psychological safety and provide real-life, meaningful opportunities for connection and belonging. We're also challenged to provide young people with critical thinking skills required to view the curated online lives of their peers and their role models with perspective that we're all actually a little, or maybe a lot, messy behind the scenes. Finally, constructive communication practices. So we're going to talk a lot this afternoon about the power of language and narratives to open up or shut down hope. We'll do that in the workshop and give some specific tools around that as well. I would, however, just like to briefly speak to this piece about the power of stories that we tell ourselves and others. So as humans, we have to process this constant influx of information. It's too much to take in. If I took in every shadow and color and face in this room, I would be totally overwhelmed. I would be unable to think or move. So what we do, it's very convenient, our minds categorize things. This is what stereotypes are. This is what helps us tell the difference between our socks and our pants, or between one person and another person, and know what to expect when we walk into a restaurant will be on the table and how the general script will go. Again, helpful most of the time. But it turns out these very same mechanisms, when we turn them on ourselves and other people, the stories we tell, they also impact where our attention goes and what we remember to be true. So the stories we are already telling ourselves, what's true of us, what's true of other people, have a massive influence on the information that we continue to take in over time and what we believe to be true. It's called a confirmation bias. We are much more likely to continue receiving information that confirms what we already believe to be true. So it's a lot more effortful to learn to see ourselves and others in a new light than it is to continue seeing through our most familiar lenses. But it's also the most reliable way to grow and to learn. When we intentionally engage in communication practices that allow us to see ourselves and others from a new perspective, using new language, new possibilities emerge. We'll talk much more this afternoon about the specific communication tools that facilitate these new ways of seeing and thinking.
And with that, I have 7 minutes to do 14 pages. So I will just tell you a story. 25 years ago, when I started Imagine Chicago, it started from a very simple thing. I was heartbroken about the waste of young lives in our city. Many, many kids were checking out. Violence, drugs, dropping out of school, things that are still happening now. But I really began to wonder and to dream about what it was that was shaping the imagination of life in a big city, which began to see so many things, innovative things as possible, and yet was so limited in seeing a way to move into the future past the divides which were beginning to define and exclude young people. Ronald Marston once said, "Justice is fundamentally a matter of who is included and whom we could tolerate neglecting." And in 1992, it was simply the case that many young people's lives were being lost. And the measure of that was that we began commonly to hear young people in our city, especially if they were of a certain color or a certain economic status, as being described as a lost generation, which meant even though you're sitting in front of me, you're as good as dead in my own imagination about the future. So I convened a conference on faith, imagination, and public life. And in that conference, someone challenged all of us with a very big question, which was, what are God's dreams for this city? We don't exactly know God's dreams, but it was a question that was so provocative. I was a priest and banker, and I thought a lot about the economy and God's economy. And so I asked myself in that moment, if we were looking at the city as a whole, and dreaming about what was ultimately worthy of orienting our lives, what would that dream for the economy be? And in that moment, it came to me that the recycling symbol, an economy could come to represent, in my own imagination, God's economy, namely an economy in which nothing and no one was wasted. That began to unlock in me a huge reservoir of hope about what it would take, but I saw it as possible. It was an act of faith, but I saw it as possible. And so I began to really think about what it would take to organize such a plan. Long story short, we gathered a design team, a dream team, if you will, of people who were attracted by that very big question. It was people who work across sectors. Not surprisingly, people who are interdisciplinary pioneers, because they're not afraid of entering that world of not having the answers. They're good at adaptive challenges. They lead the charge. I suspect most of you in this room, if not all of you in this room, are in that category. And when we got together and said, what could be genuinely a process for regenerating the life of a big city? Our city at that point had more than 5 million people. And that especially the measure of the impact of which was on the lives of young people now being lost. What would that look like? And two very important insights shaped what became the subsequent process. The first was that positive communication structures were essential to moving forward. Because when we really said, what is the greatest enemy of hope? The greatest enemy of hope was the fact that cynicism passed for sophistication and often defined the quality of our public communication. So we said, what could disarm the cynicism? And when we thought about that personally, we said, we're not cynical with our own children. It's hard to look in my grandchildren's eyes and say, you might as well give it up now. But we often talk to other adults that way. So we thought, you know what? What if we took the very kids whose lives are most at risk and put them as the leaders of the process of unlocking the hope in this city and calling the city to account, to act on behalf of that greater hope in a way that expanded the we and that included them. And that's what we did. We got 50, and again, this is a very well-documented piece of work, even in the current EU practice guide for community innovation. But really at the heart of it was just when you have a young person sitting there with a real tool called a great set of questions, which they and we designed together, and they infinitely improved by their input. Asking glue people, community leaders who hold the place together against the odds about what works and visions of how things can move forward, it was bottle magic. And what we discovered in that process was a lot of civic conversation practices and framing that really opened up new possibilities. And we have 2 hours this afternoon to really share some of that at greater length. So this is not the time for that. But where it really led me was to a simple kind of observation of a practice which became true of every subsequent move to action process we did, which was 3 words: understand, imagine, create. Understand, especially the best of what is, imagine what can be, and then create what will be. And if you think of that, what it does is it opens the realm of freedom. It opens the realm of innovation, because you stand in the present, and instead of saying, well, there's the past, the present is a point on the graph, and the future is inevitably looks like the line you draw from the past to the present, you say, no. You can set that on its head by standing in the present and saying, okay, I'm going to move into the future. Stand in that future, and then move back into the present in light of the future, which demands and inspires my commitment. Understand, imagine, create. And that takes off the blinders. And then when you share the stories, when you share resources, it mobilizes the imagination. It's a natural act. I'm sorry, in the 26 seconds remaining, that we can't give you, more of a sense. The Imagine Chicago's website is literally thousands of pages, all written by yours truly. But what I can do is to really encourage you, if there are two things you can do as actions that will radically change your power as innovators. The first is to renounce cynicism and to only ask questions which unlock the best in other people, or to say it another way, questions you would appreciate being asked that can open up new ways forward. And the second is to think of the hardest work you are really struggling to figure out and trust young people to help you figure it out. Because when you bring that different perspective into the room with young people, not as a problem to be solved, but as a new set of eyes to be mobilized, where their contribution is the key to what happens next, they really wake up and see the difference. And that can change everything. With that, I'm going to turn it back over very quickly to Caroline, just to give you another story, because, of course, stories are magic. I also have to say, the most important thing she did at age 8 when I started this was to say to me, "Mom, this sounds like really hard work. What's going to make it work?" And I said, "I don't know. What do you think?" And she said, "Have the funnest meetings. Because if you have the funnest meetings, everyone will come to your meetings instead of the other people's meetings."
So we're going to end with a story. This is not ours. Who actually wrote this?
It's an Indian parable.
An Indian parable. Along a dusty road in India, there sat a beggar that sold cocoons. A young boy watched him day after day, and finally the beggar beckoned to him. "Do you know what beauty lies within this chrysalis? I will give you one so you can see for yourself, but you must be careful not to handle the cocoon until the butterfly comes out." The boy was enchanted with the gift and hurried home to await the butterfly. He laid the cocoon on the floor and became aware of a curious thing. The butterfly was beating its fragile wings against the hard wall of the cocoon until it appeared that it would surely perish before it could break the unyielding prison. Wanting only to help, the boy swiftly pried the cocoon open. Out flopped a wet, brown, ugly little thing, which quickly died. When the beggar discovered what had happened, he explained to the boy, "In order for the butterfly wings to grow strong enough to support him, it is necessary that he beat them against the walls of the cocoon. Only by this struggle can his wings become beautiful and durable. When you denied him that struggle, you took away his only chance of survival." So how can we hold young people as they struggle, knowing they are built for transformation? Thank you.